Good morning and welcome. A warm welcome to everyone joining this webinar where we'll be discussing the new report, Lessons from Homeschooling. What practical lessons can we learn from the coronavirus crisis to help improve education systems? My name's Jane Mann and I'm the Managing Director of the Cambridge Partnership for Education, and we were delighted to be part of supporting this research. Today we're going to hear some of the highlights from the report, and then we'll follow that with a live Q&A session with our panel. I know that some of you have already submitted questions, which I've got here, but please also do just post any questions that you may have throughout the session. So just to flag, there are no anonymous questions, so if you submit a question, it will appear with your name in the Q&A box. Please do use the Q&A box for your questions, not the chat box. And this event will be recorded, and we'll make sure we send a link out afterwards to all of you so that you can watch it all over again. It's definitely become a real cliche to say that these are unprecedented times, or that this is a new normal, or that never before have so many children had their education disrupted. But of course, the thing about cliches is that behind those tired phrases, there is usually a kernel of truth. And at the time that the research that underpins this report was being carried out, 1.6 billion children were out of school around the world. With the rollout of the vaccination programs in the UK, it is beginning to feel like we can see light at the end of the tunnel. I read this morning that the UK is now in the top 4 countries for the number of Covid-19 vaccine doses that have been administered. And it's really tempting to think that very soon we'll just consign COVID to the history books. But it's also worth remembering that based on current availability of vaccines, the African Union's current timetable is to have vaccinated 60% of the continent in 3 years' time. So regardless of the rapid vaccine rollout in the UK, we will be living with the impact of COVID-19 for some time to come, and we are still understanding the full impact of the pandemic on learning. Sir Kevin Collins has recently been appointed as the Education Recovery Commissioner to develop a long-term plan for helping pupils in England's schools to make up for lost learning, and getting schools open and education back on track has been declared a national priority. So we have £1 billion worth of catch-up funding that's been announced, and that includes subsidies for tutoring services. But one more thing that's immediately obvious is the way that the crisis has driven a wedge into already existing inequalities. In the UK, it has increased the equity gap in numerous ways, from models of teaching and learning through access to technology, access to nutrition programs. And in June 2020, the Education Endowment Foundation estimated that school closures could reverse 10 years worth of progress made in addressing the attainment gap in England. All ideas are on the table, we are told, including extending the school term or extending the school day. And we've got policy announcements promised for next week. But the crisis has also forced rapid change. McKinsey estimates that COVID-19 has accelerated digital transformation by 7 years in Europe and by 10 years in the Asia-Pacific region. Over the past year, we've been forced to look at the education ecosystem in different ways, find new ways of solving new or sometimes old problems, which is why this report is so important. The lessons that we learn from lockdown should not necessarily be what to do next time some exceptional circumstances force the closure of schools. The lessons are about coherence of the education system, about how to identify and make the most of effective innovations, about what skills we need to develop and nurture in teachers, and how we can design positive change that improves learning and improves access to education. So to discuss the research and its findings some more, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Professor Rose Luckin and to her panel to introduce themselves, and we'll then hear more from Professor Luckin about some of the findings from the report. Rose.
Mute, right, get myself off mute. Thank you very much, Jane. It's been such a pleasure to work with you on this research, and it's great to have this opportunity to talk about it. Panel, would you like to give a brief introduction to yourself? I think we should start with Charles, please.
Rose, thank you very much for having me on this. I'm very much looking forward to it. My name is Charles Clarke. I'm a consultant for the Cambridge Partnership for Education, and previously have been Education Minister and Secretary of State for Education, and have been involved in these issues over a long period of my life.
Thank you, Charles. And Jane, I guess you've already introduced yourself, so would you like to say anything more about yourself?
As a joint unit across Cambridge University Press and Cambridge Assessment, it's great that we've managed to get involved with your team, Rose, on this research.
Thank you, Jane. Carmel, next.
I am the head of data science in Educate Ventures, and essentially one of about 10 to 15 people that were directly involved in carrying this research.
Thank you, Carmel. And Karine.
Hello, I'm the Chief Education Advisor now for Educate Ventures. I was previously a head teacher for more than 20 years and have worked in the education sector across key stages since 1981. So I've been at the coalface with the changes that have happened over a long period of time, an advisor and speak nationally on these issues.
Thank you, that's great. A really lovely panel, and thank you for all agreeing to be here. I'm just going to spend a few minutes doing a summary to introduce the report that we conducted, and then we'll move back and Jane will moderate some questions. And it's such a great opportunity to tell you all about this research. So when the pandemic started a year ago, basically, we felt, right, we have to do something. We have to try and find out what's going on. We need to know how education is coping with this. And we didn't just want to look at schools or look at teachers. We wanted to try and capture the ecosystem, the whole ecosystem, with particular respect to educational technology. So we wanted to look at parents, teachers, schools, governors, policymakers, edtech companies, and try and understand what was happening from their perspective. Because this was an unprecedented opportunity, an experiment. You know, it was an experiment that nobody wanted to happen, but it was here and we needed to understand because we need to learn. As Jane has said, it's all about learning lessons. And it was a wonderful opportunity for us as Educate Ventures, which is a spin-off company from UCL Knowledge Lab, where I'm a professor. And we really wanted to work with Cambridge to do this research to find out what was going on. So key findings, too little attention was paid to the education ecosystem. So its wholeness. When schools closed and the majority of pupils received far less education and nobody really knew quite what to do, much of the focus was on individual parts of the education ecosystem rather than seeing it as a whole. Now, there's no question about it. Educators, parents, educational leaders did an amazing job. Overnight, they managed to put in place provision for the majority of pupils. And I think we have to applaud the immense achievements that is. But nevertheless, of course, we know it highlighted the divisions that already existed. But much of the problems around those divisions is connected to this issue of not seeing the whole ecosystem when we look to try and see how we deal with crises like the coronavirus. And so we found in our research ineffective connections and communications between the communities that make up that ecosystem, in particular between government and school leaders, education, parents. And that lack of communication and connection really compromised the integrity of the whole ecosystem, because a good ecosystem is self-supportive and it's resilient and it's able to deal with whatever comes its way within reason. And really that means that we have to build better connections, better communication channels between the different parts of that ecosystem. And so over the months from March last year, and actually we still ask a question for the week to a variety of communities, we started to collect data. And the data that we report here in 2 volumes, one is the evidence and the other is the implications, is really taken from a broad range of sources. We looked at the evidence that was coming through from other people's research. We looked at what was happening on Twitter. we conducted questionnaires. We conducted a question for the day for several months from March through to the summer holidays last year. We did 10 question questionnaires, 7 question questionnaires. We looked at websites, we conducted interviews. We wanted to try and get a broad range of data that would tell us something about the ecosystem. And so, as I've said, we had some key findings, which were around too little attention being paid to the whole system and this lack of connection and communication. But what does that mean specifically? So let me give you a few key examples and then some thoughts about how we take this work forward. So one of the key connections that wasn't there was there was very little connection between what we know about how to put in place good online learning and the sort of remote education or remote emergency teaching, as we call it, that took place. So there was a poor connection between the evidence about what works and what was put in place. That's understandable because I think for years there's been an ineffective connection between the research community and the practice community, and that's certainly something that we can improve. But good connections were built between edtech companies and educators and educational leaders. And I think that's something that we should be very pleased about. We certainly found that leaders, teachers, parents were all far more willing to try new pieces of kit, to get out there, to give things a go than they were previously. And so there was a move towards edtech companies being seen as there to be supportive to the education system, not just something on which you spent money. So I think that was really positive, and the edtech community did a lot to help, lots of services and products at reduced prices, etc., etc. But I think we need to think about those connections and building that self-supporting ecosystem. So some of the real interesting problems were how poorly the concerns of the different communities were understood. So whilst we hear, for example, a great deal about falling behind and learning loss, which of course are serious issues, in actual fact, they weren't the primary concern for all parental groups. So for example, if you think about single parent families, then actually falling behind wasn't their key concern. It was more to do with actual financial concerns. So 59% of single parents had financial concerns, whereas only 16% of non-single parent families had those same financial concerns that were drawing their attention. And so I think we really need to recognize the differences in the community. The key finding for us as a research team is that we need to find ways of building better connections between the different parts of the ecosystem, but we also need to recognize diversity. And if we look at special educational needs, then only 28% of the parents of children who were disadvantaged in this way felt that their child's education placement had provided very good support. And sadly, 40% felt they'd received no support at all. So we do really have some challenges that we need to recognize when it comes to making the most and learning these lessons, because as Jane has said, learning the lessons is the key thing. And I think we saw throughout the research, one of the reasons we wanted to conduct research over a longer period was to see the changes. And I can say that huge lessons were learned within the educational community about how to improve the education provision at times of restriction due to the pandemic. Unfortunately, I don't feel lessons have been learned by the government. And we found in our research that one of the key things that was important was the extent to which people within the ecosystem, different communities, felt supported. That was fundamentally important. And less than 2.5% of heads, teachers, and parents felt supported by the government. And I think that's a really interesting statistic. And indeed, within the report, you'll see the enormous burden of information that came from the government, often at midnight, often contradicting something that had come out before, that really put huge pressure on educators in particular, and in particular on educational leaders. And often they felt overwhelmed by this. So there's a huge amount to learn from this research. I do hope that you'll enjoy reading the report. I'm really looking forward to the questions that you might have to ask us about it, because it's very rich. The data that we've collected is very rich, and we really need to mine these findings to try and bring about improvements to the education system, so that all of this that's happened over the last year is not wasted, so that we end up with a much more functional and much greater understanding about how we really build that self-supporting, resilient ecosystem to ensure that all parts work effectively, support each other, and they can cope with whatever comes their way. Because I think there's one thing for sure, this COVID-19 pandemic is not going to be the last challenge that we face. So we really do need to get ourselves into a position where we know we can cope with anything. So that's a really brief introduction to the work as we have it. And as we go through the questions, more and more parts of what we did, I'm sure, will be revealed. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Rose. And I think you've definitely given us enough there to make anybody want to read that report in greater detail as well. So thank you. So the first question is one that was sent in prior to the event, actually. I'm afraid I don't have the details of who sent this, but it's a question. I'm going to pose this question to Carmel and Karine, actually. The question is, in order to help schools apply the benefits and improve the learning process from the information gathered during the pandemic, does the panel see the need to have a learning analyst become a member of the school team? So the suggestion is that a learning analyst could translate the insights and information gathered into changes needed to improve the learning process applied in each school.
Carmel?
Yeah, Karine, please take it. I think your experience is directly on this question.
Okay, I really believe it is really helpful to have someone that understands data analysis in your school, but there's a caveat to that. That person also needs to have some understanding of how schools run and the pedagogies that supports the question that you're trying to solve, because otherwise you're going to have a disconnect. Now, the issues are, as we become more, technology becomes more interwoven into teaching, now that everybody's utilizing it, it's going to be important when we're looking at particular goals that we're trying to reach or particular questions that we answer, that we can use data appropriately. Now, when I was a head teacher, I managed to have somebody to do my data analysis. I was only in a state school. I wasn't in a multi-academy trust. So there's economies of scale that you have to think about, because that's an extra cost in a system that's already underfunded. So I managed to use somebody that was my maths teacher who happened to have a degree, and I was just lucky. And when she went part-time because of maternity, she came back and did my data, and she had a fantastic understanding of the workings and the context of our school. And that was really important. She understood the context, what we were trying to achieve, what the goals were, what the vision was. Now, we've got to, you heard Rose talk about connections. We need to develop that further. It could be that teacher trainer changes in the future to incorporate people who have that specialism more, but also who perhaps they come from a data analysis background, but a bit like when we used to have educational psychologists, they had to do so many years in school first to understand the landscape, because the point is we're too siloed and we need to we need to walk in each other's shoes. So there will be a place for having data analysts in school, I think. But what we don't want to do is what I had to do is take a teacher, I had to wait for a teacher that I could use in a part-time capacity. We don't want to take a teacher out of a classroom and give them another role. They're already analysing data to a certain extent, but we've already got lots of bias in the system. So if we want the expertise, we've got to put in the training, we've got to make sure the training's right, and we've got to give the funding as well so that schools can have these. Now, multi-academy trusts and places where there's bigger economies of scale, particularly the independent sector, are more likely to be able to do this. But if we don't, we've got to be careful not to, to create another gulf, another disadvantage for some systems compared to others, by some being able to afford it and others not.
Thanks, Karine. Carmel, do you want to add to that?
No, actually, Karine said it all. I think for us to really understand where our pupils at and where they're struggling and what we really want to provide, what are their needs, etc., we must engage in data collection. That's a must. It's not just in schools, it's also it's also part of what the ecosystem. But at the end of the day, it is the schools that needs to be sitting on that channel and providing the teachers better understanding of how to help the students. So absolutely, we need to have more learning analytics in schools. We need to be very, very cautious about this thin line between learning analytics and surveillance. I think that's a very, very important thing to, because we hear a lot about higher education mainly, but it will certainly come down to secondary schools very soon. All kinds of software used in order to provide exams, environment, etc. And the place where learning analytics, which is mainly aims to provide formative assessment and tools for better learning and teaching, to surveillance is really, really gentle. And we need to, that's exactly where we lose trust in the system. That's exactly where we lose everything that is fundamental for effective learning. So I think we just need to be to do that very, very carefully.
Sure. Thanks, Carmel. So the next question is, changes in education often mean very long transition periods. What can we practically do to speed this process up and see these recommendations working? Charles, I'm going to come to you first on that question, please.
Jane, I think there are two absolutely central things, both of which are very difficult to achieve. The first is a sense of consensus and agreement amongst all the various elements as to where you make progress. Rose referred to this in her analysis because it comes down to understanding concerns of all the people involved, whether it's teachers, parents, very importantly the children themselves, support staff, a whole range of different people. At the moment, I would say we're not in a good place on that. I'm the last person to be pious about the relationship between the education trade unions and the government of the day, but it's quite clear throughout this process there's been a kind of running warfare going on, which has made it very difficult to get that kind of consensus. And of course, the teachers are the most important component in this, with the parents and the children. So that first building of consensus is crucially important. If you then want to put through change, if it's going to be a battle of people being for or against in different places and where it goes, it will take an immense amount of time and lead to a less successful outcome. The second component, which I think is as important but also very difficult, is high quality leadership. And I mean high quality leadership at the school level principally. I'm not seeking the impossible in terms of government. The key question is to have head teachers and their teams and their governing bodies working together effectively to try and make the changes which happen. My own experience, which is entirely anecdotal, not researched like Rose's work, of this pandemic has been there have been very variable performances indeed by different schools, and it didn't depend on whether you were a private school, a state school, or whatever. It depended on the quality of leadership that was going on. I use leadership as a general term, not simply to apply to the school leader, the head teacher, but to the whole team and to the whole of the school, operating leadership at all levels. So, Jane, my answer to the question is, in order to see the recommendations happening, you need firstly to really work on building consensus and agreement around them by listening to the concerns, the genuine concerns that all participants have. And secondly, you need high quality leadership to say, well, having listened to those concerns, what is the way to make the changes that we need to achieve?
Thank you, Charles. We've started to get lots of questions through on the Q&A, so I'm going to move on actually to another question now. So this question comes from Philip Avery. Does an increased emphasis on the ecosystem mean we need place-based solutions? Can national curricular policies and programmes be effective? Rose, do you want to pick that one up?
Fascinating question, really fascinating question. Yes, we have definitely suggested a focus on the ecosystem. I would just like to say there are 10 policy recommendations in the report, and we've tried to be very practical because I think people need some fairly quick ways forward. But of course, we also need to do what Charles was saying about building consensus and building that long-term vision. But as to the propensity for things like national curricula, that is a very, very interesting question. I think, yes, we can still have national level recommendations, but we need to recognize that different parts of the community need different sorts of support in order to reach the same achievement levels within that national curriculum, and possibly recognition of different sorts of achievement within that national curriculum. So one of the ways that we tried to address this need for diversity, it's hugely complicated. Of course, there are lots and lots of different sub-communities of sub-communities, and you can't understand all of them. So practically, what can you do? So we came up with 5 personas of stakeholders. Now, these are personas that were drawn from the data. And these 5 personas, which we may talk about a little later, give you 5 different ways of looking at how you support different parts of the ecosystem. So if you're thinking about something like a national curriculum, you could start with those 5 different groups and think, okay, what do I need to do for this particular group in order to ensure that they're supported to achieve? Alternatively, what do I need to do for this slightly different group in order to ensure that they achieve? So we've tried to find a practical way of recognizing diversity and building those connections. And I think that would still allow national level initiatives. But it's about recognizing how different people's contexts impact on their ability to actually meet that national curriculum in the same way. And it's about the support that you need to put in place in order to enable them to achieve. I hope that starts to address your question, Phil.
Thanks, Rose. I'm assuming that the panel will shout if they want to come in on any of these, otherwise I'll just carry on going through the questions. One here from Aftab Hussain. Observers may state that individual schools stood alone when managing online homeschooling. Some schools did better than others, but management was not consistent and uniform. Does the education sector need a national advocacy body or government department to lead and direct the education sector with regard to online learning? Who would like to pick that one up? Charles, go ahead.
Well, certainly we do. I mean, we used to have one. It was called Bector, and it was abolished in 2010. And it was designed to support the development of online learning, because, of course, one of the difficulties, Rose talked about the EdTech world earlier, for the average school, understanding what the EdTech world can really offer in their school, in their circumstances, particularly when there's competition taking place between the various suppliers, is very tough. And many schools want to try and understand what can be offered and how it can best be offered in their particular circumstances. Going back to the previous question, nothing will work unless it's implemented locally in the particular circumstances of a school, and you have to have that as the core. There hasn't been a national advocacy body for the last 10 years as a result in this area, and I've noticed myself trying to talk to government about it. It's been very difficult to get coherent views about the way in which it should be worked. There were some interesting initiatives out of COVID that emerged, which were supported by the government, that were interesting in this area. But my fundamental answer to the question is, yes, you do need that. I mean, the whole question of online is obviously our whole lives are going to be transformed forever as a result of this experience under COVID. It won't disappear with COVID. And so we have to get the best possible online practice part and parcel of what schools are doing all the time, and that requires a serious advocacy organisation of a variety of different types. And it is genuinely difficult for people to make choices between what's the best way of doing it, what's not, and they need advice and support in doing that.
Thanks, Charles. Karine, you look like you've got something to say about that as well.
Yes, Vector was a real loss to the educational community. I was a member of the Vector community because it was your go-to shop to look at research and evidence and to see it in practice, because there's a lot of miscommunication out there about the benefits of technology. I was talking to a head the other day that said, well, it was published in a recent government document to say that, you know, the work with online learning isn't effective using technologies. Well, you know, you need to have people who can actually showcase what they're doing, what the goals are they're trying to reach, because there's a lot of miscommunication. Vector was able to do that. When it folded, some of the members still stayed together. They reshaped into a group called Leading Leaders, but with no funding. And this is where you get school leaders and members from technology community who'll work together despite there being no body. But it's hard to maintain that when there's no finances, to go round and look at schools that are showing exemplary practice and are leading the way, you know, the early adopters that are showing, and also the early adopters that are finding out what's going wrong so they can show that case that, you know, with us. So, you know, to back Charles up, we definitely need that back again, or, you know, some similar groups like that formed again.
And can I just add, Jane, it needs to do more than just look at educational technology. It fundamentally must start looking at data and artificial intelligence and data-driven systems, because that is a big part of what's coming to education. And we really need a strong advocacy body to make sure that as those technologies arrive, they are really driven by sound learning, by the understanding of what the research says about teaching and learning. We really need to make sure that we don't become more of a Wild West, that we have this strong advocacy body that ensures that all of our uses of technology, whatever it is, are driven by pedagogy, are driven by sound principles of teaching and learning. And I think a point that Carmel brought in earlier around the data and the data analysts, there's no question in my mind that everybody in education will need to have a much better understanding of data. They don't need to learn how to build an AI algorithm, or they don't need to do that, but there is a need for a greater understanding of data and the role that it can play, because the truth of the matter is that whether it's an edtech company or an AI company, to set up one of these organizations, you don't need to understand anything about teaching and learning. Now, many of them do, and many of them are really good, but we really, really need that advocacy body.
Thanks, Rose. Question here from Yvonne Williams. Shouldn't more effort be made throughout this process to engage with individual teachers? Aren't we concentrating too much on leaders rather than what was going on at the chalk face, and not just through questionnaires which give you a view of the majority of the mass? Who would like to pick that up? Karine, go ahead.
I think that's the case. I think in our report we did connect with teachers on the ground. We had a multitude of different ways of connecting the ecosystem together. One of them was through interviews. So I interviewed many, not just teachers who were on the ground facing, you know, on the chalk face, because that's what's missing in lots of the bodies that you see that are talking about education. Where is the teacher that's faced that event? Where are, you know, and enough of them on those groups? Often it's just the token teacher. So I think you're dead right, and we've tried to address that through interviews as well. And the question, I know we've got question of the day that goes out to teachers regularly, but we've got a whole host of initiatives coming up and roundtables and events to keep bringing that voice to the table.
Thanks, Karine. And a question here sort of linking to that from Rajeshwari Ira, saying, how are the findings being shared with teachers and schools who should in effect be the end beneficiaries of this study?
Well, one of the wonderful things about working with Cambridge on this is that it's all free. So the evidence volume, which is how many pages long is it in the end, Carmel? There's a lot of it there. And the implications volume are all there for free on your website, on our website, or they will be by the end of this week. And we're, as Karine said, we're also running a series of free events to try and push it out. We will make it available to educators. But it's a really important question. How do we get this key information to the people who really need it? And it's actually something that's been an issue for the research community for many years. How do we get sound research into practice? It's certainly not straightforward. And that's why we have to make a concerted effort to get this to the people who really need it.
I think one of the things that we did try very hard to do in in this report, but also in other venues that we are working on, is doing some kind of a translational research. So we never conduct research which doesn't have anything actionable or some kind of very, very hardcore recommendations. And I think the report is full of many tips, advices, you know, in the long-term, short-term strategy, everything on how to take the next steps. But it certainly goes back again and again and again in all of the questions that you raised, Jane, to the, I think, to the element of community. So even if we would have an advisory board, even if we would have very good programs and tips from the research community to the practice community, even if we would have lots of interviews and raising the voices of teachers very regularly, we need to have a conversation. We need to listen. So one of the things that we try to do with this report is actually listen, you know, through Twitter, through interviews, through any kind of venue, to kind of bring up this very inclusive voice base to actually hear. But I think this is something that needs to be done on a regular basis. Nobody can make decisions and put policies and anything without actually listening all the time to what is going on in the field. That's, yeah.
Thanks, Carmel. A question here, which I'm going to put to Charles, from Michael Condon, who says, to what extent does the panel feel that the social contract with young people and families should include access to a device and data plans? It's harder to level up when you can't connect.
It certainly should, and indeed that's one of the few things I would say. But anyway, one of the things the government said it would do right at the beginning of this last February or March, so far without full success as far as I can see, but that was an ambition that they had, and it certainly is absolutely necessary. However, the question comes back, how do you use this kit? It's not simply a question of kit. I've seen other countries actually where ministers have put whole chunks of kit into schools, which have ended up simply in cardboard boxes in cupboards and so on, because the question is how you use it. And that requires both the individuals who get it, who the questioner is talking about, but also the teachers themselves to know how to use it. The key word is the one Rose used a couple of answers ago, is pedagogy. You have to find a new pedagogy to deal with the use for this. So I do think there's, you can call it a digital divide or whatever language, that is necessary to overcome to ensure that everybody has access to the kit they need. That is absolutely true. But that's really the easy part in a funny way. The hard part is to ensure that whatever online exists is able to be used effectively. And that's a much harder call. And just to say to one of the earlier questions, of course, teachers themselves have to be engaged in that, but I wouldn't put it in opposite categories, leadership and teachers. I think leaders should be about enabling individual teachers, and for that matter, enabling parents. And I hope that one of the things that's learned out of this whole experience will be the need to engage parents fully more in the whole educational experience. They've had to be by force majeure in the current circumstances, and many have found it very tough. But many of them want to help their children learn, but don't know how. And so the question is, how do you help parents help educate their own children?
That's such an important point. And actually the data is really clear. Schools that had effective communication with parents absolutely did much better. So it's really interesting if you look at the data in the report that good communication with parents was fundamental to those parents feeling that their child was receiving a successful education and feeling positive about the experience. But this digital point is really important. I agree with everything Charles has said. And the latest OECD data is really clear on this. It's our distribution of digital devices is where the problem is, rather than just the number of devices. If you are in a more privileged area, you really do have access to good digital technology. And it's not just in the home. The evidence suggests that it's about what the school has too. So it's at a school level that you need to address this, not just in the individual home. Obviously, at a time of COVID, the individual home starts to have more impact. So it's not just about the number, it's about the distribution and making sure they're with the right community who need them. It's not just the device, it's the network as well. So you need to have a reliable network. You need to have a place to learn, and you need somebody who's going to validate the fact that you want to learn. And that's a social issue. But one of the key findings in that OECD data, which absolutely speaks to what Charles is saying, is that the UK does not incentivize teachers to become good at integrating technology into their practice. So we are actually above average on the number of devices that exist, but as I say, they're poorly distributed and unevenly distributed, and way below average on the way that we incentivize the use of digital technologies integrated into teacher practice. So it is more complex than the devices. We absolutely must get the devices in the right places, but we also have to have that incentivization for teachers and the reward for teachers who invest time in learning how to integrate their technology into their practice.
Thanks, Rose. There's an aligned question here actually to that, just to extend that a bit further, from Miriam Hobbs, who says there's a lot of training out there with regard to what makes excellent online learning, but very little information about what is the most effective way to deliver online learning to different age groups. Miriam's questions just disappeared from my view, but what she's effectively saying is, what works at university level doesn't necessarily work at year 7. So what can we do about that to make sure that we are supporting teachers in making sure what they're delivering is for the right age group?
Well, just as I think, Jane, for me, all this comes back to the pedagogy word, and there's not a universal pedagogy that applies from age 5 to age 25, or for that matter to age 80. It changes by each year, obviously, and serious work needs to be done on what is the best pedagogy for each particular group to directly answer the question that's been raised. But there's a key question here. One can talk about doing this in initial teacher training to ensure that teachers at their initial education are able to deal with that. However, by definition, that becomes out of date almost immediately. And so the core question actually is, what kind of continuous professional development exists for teachers throughout their teaching life to address these questions? I think myself is that online CPD is absolutely the core way to move forward in this and to make progress quickly throughout a teacher's professional life. And in that, you can take, for example, all the teachers in year 7 and say, okay, what if you're a teacher in year 7, should we be trying to support you in doing to provide the training support to integrate online or digital education into your area? And I would say, A, that there's not enough done on that now, and B, that it's a massive expansion area of great potential. People have resisted it because they thought teacher training, in-service teacher training should be something done in person, for example, on the famous Baker Days or whatever it might happen to be. I think that's completely inadequate for the modern time, and it should be that CPD for teachers, addressing the pedagogy issues of each level of education is what should be achieved, and for that matter, of each subject.
Thanks, Charles. Karine, you've got something to say there as well.
One of the things I want to say on that is that when we talk about this and training for teachers, what happens is it becomes a bolt-on to an already overloaded curriculum. And we have got teachers, we're already suffering a teacher shortage, we can end up having a bigger one. It comes down to, we need total reform, because the noose around the neck of learning is our testing and examination systems, through which everything, if you pull that little thread, your performance review, your league table, your Ofsted report, all come back to that. And the fundamental issue is we do not trust our teachers, okay? We do not give them time to research, to try things out, to work in peer networks. There is no time built in to the educational system to do that. So we just overload them, everything gets watered down and nothing really gets the attention it needs. So we can't add on, you know, my caution here is what Charles is saying is right, but we can't add it on as a bolt-on, because we've got to really completely reform the system, because otherwise, you know, I'm already worried that we're going to lose even more teachers. So that's just, sorry, that's my passionate plea here to anybody that, you know, if we manage to get any reform, that happens, that we think about that, because that's what we need. Teachers do need their you know, the professional capital, and they want it. It's not that they don't want it. There's just no, you know, I had 66 training, you know, online training courses I had to do for health and safety, ladder training. I mean, you wouldn't believe the amount of just health and safety training a teacher has to do online before they even do anything to do with pedagogy. So that's, you know, that's why we need to look at the whole.
Thanks, Karine. Question here from Mariam Makramala saying, are some of the lessons learned in the UK reproducible in potentially similar contexts? And if so, in what way? Rose, do you want to tackle that?
Absolutely, yes. The report here is based on UK data, but we were very mindful of thinking about some of the issues that we see all over the world. And the issue of ecosystem is absolutely fundamental. It's something that we've seen through the work we've done with EdTech companies. We run a program called Educate, which is all about connecting educators with the people who build the EdTech, with the researchers who can help both of those communities to understand how to collect and understand data and evidence about what's working and what's not working. And those fundamental connections are true wherever you are. You need to build those connections. Obviously, different countries have different issues, different specific subcomponents within their ecosystem, different challenges and different cultures. But there is a lot that can be learned, that can be taken from from this report, that can be taken and can be applied in many parts of the world. Particularly, as I say, the pieces around connecting and communicating and building that self-supporting, resilient ecosystem. And there's also some very practical tips in this report, you know, tips for head teachers about, okay, so I need to get to deal with this practically. I need to get some kind of educational provision in place. What do I do? How do I go about it? There's an example from Singapore, for example, about how to build teacher communities. Again, something that can be done all over the world and we know will be helpful. So absolutely, there are useful lessons and I hope useful resources for any teacher or educational leader wherever you are in this.
Jane, can I please comment something about the previous question by Miriam, because she just wrote something so brilliant in the chat box. She said, no one knows the kids more than I do, my kids more than I do. And I think that's the most important point here, because it's not just that different year groups would need different context. It just, you know, year 7 in East London is going to be very, very different than year 7 in Liverpool. And in this year 7 in Liverpool, there would be in a class of 30 students, you will have 30 typical different needs. So I think what we do need at the end of the day, we can recommend technologies, we can recommend pedagogies, we can recommend how to fit pedagogy to technology. But at the end of the day, it's only the teacher who can design what they need in the classroom. So, and I'm going back to the point of collecting data. If you would have very good effective data collection and you would get to know the students in an effective way, because we all know the teachers don't have time to do really thorough data collection, but this is where technology can come and help. So if you would get a very effective image of each of your children, you would have the tools to actually contextualize technology so I think context. It's never about one size fit all, and it's usually in the hands of the teachers to know best what the children will need.
Thanks, Carmel. That also answers a few of the other questions that are asking questions about how localized and contextualized solutions need to be. Question here about the research from Jude Brady. How did you determine the boundaries of who and what was part of the education ecosystem?
That's a good question. I'm actually going to let Carmel answer in the main on that, because she was our sort of data guru and data scientist. Yeah, Carmel, do you want to start? And I can come in at any point if you want.
It is a great question. One thing to be said, and that's the one thing that every data scientist and every researcher would say anytime. There is a huge gap between your desired sample and your available sample. So that's one thing that we had to work with. Everyone was desperately tired and desperately overloaded with tons of requests for interviews and to be interviewed and to collect data from, and we had to work with what we had. Having said that, we took an approach which was very ecological. And when I mean ecological in two dimensions. One dimension that I think Rose already mentioned is that we didn't rely on just one source of data. So we all the time we insisted to have data coming from different stakeholders, so not just parents and not just the teachers and not just edtech companies, etc. And different data sources. So what you can see in Twitter would be completely different from what you can hear in interviews, would be completely different from what you can get from literature review and questionnaire, etc., etc. But the other dimension is that we were very iterative all the time. So we used to have these iterations of data collection. We would look at the data and we would come up with all kinds of insights that we didn't have yet before we had the data collected. And from that, we went on to design what are the next research questions, what are we going to target next, who are the population that we don't have yet enough from. We tried to partner with all kinds of friends of ours, for example, Square Pegs and Parent Ping and Teacher Tap, that would help us to get to the population that we needed. So it's really, and it's an ongoing iterational process to listen and redesign all the time.
Thanks, Carmel. I just literally just now answered my Parent Ping questions for the day, which included a question on whether or not I was going to make my children pancakes today. So thanks, Parent Ping, for reminding me that it's Pancake Day. So there's lots of questions actually around what edtech companies can do to further support educators. One from Julian Brooks asking what edtech companies can do to further support educators when students return to school. And there's questions about, what should the takeaways be from this research for edtech startups or other edtech companies?
I would say data. It's about, well, it's absolutely about ensuring that you're constantly asking the question, is my technology product or service really meeting the need of my customer? How do I know? What data am I collecting? How am I analyzing that data? How am I evidencing that? And we have our free Educate program starting again for any edtech that's not been on it. It'll start again at the end of this month, which exactly helps to show people how to do this. Over and above that, I think it's really about understanding your customer. What we found when we looked at what some of the edtech companies were doing was the companies who were quick to react, for example, by adapting their product or service to help it be useful for social distancing or useful in a social distanced situation, or making their product or service more useful for home learning, being responsive, but being responsive in a way that demonstrates you understand what your customers need. I think that's the key thing. And the only way you can do that is really by collecting data and understanding from that data so that you map what your edtech is providing onto what's really needed in the circumstances. And a final point on this, I believe passionately in lean participatory design. I think it's the only way to get effective educational technology there. but it's so often misunderstood as being, oh, well, you build what the participants, the teachers, the learners, the parents, whoever you're designing for tell you. It's absolutely not that. It's about understanding the context, the needs, the pressures, the challenges that your customers are facing, so that you can then address those and work with those customers to make sure your product or service really does meet that need.
Thanks, Rose. I think we've probably got time for one or two more questions, depending on how quickly you answer them. The first one is from Yvonne Williams, who wants to know how much importance you attach to the emotional aspect of the experience of teaching and learning online. And you've talked a lot already about communication, I know, Rose, but if relationships between school and the community are well managed, isn't the rest going to be easier?
So much so, but I'm going to let Karine really answer this, because as a head teacher, I know she has well, we all have strong feelings about it. There's no question that the social and emotional well-being of educators as well as pupils is the key thing that we have to try and build. And we can see huge evidence of the problems that we have in that space. So yes, fundamentally, it's that relationship that's so important. But Karine, I'm going to bring you in, because I know, you know, you're very passionate and have so much practical experience about.
Okay, so for me, we have to learn how to teach differently online and build those relationships. That's absolutely key. And when the lockdown happened, the first thing I got involved in was talking to teachers, and in fact making some videos about how do you have those relationships, how do you build that important connection online, because it isn't the same. We can't just replicate a lesson and stick it online. It won't work. It's really important. And we have to think about well-being in a number of ways, because, you know, we have had children who thrived during lockdown, you know, because they haven't had the pressures of school, and they've actually preferred learning online. So we've got to learn from all of these lessons about how do we do it differently. And that is going to take some training for people to showcase and share different methodologies of working. Now, well-being is absolutely key. And I'm just going to move slightly across from that, because my worry with that is we have heard, you know, our survey showed for most parents that they were very concerned about the well-being of their young people, you know, their youngsters, as were teachers. You know, we talk about in this report that what we want people to do is to listen, you know, and to talk together about what we've learned from the lessons. And then what do you hear the rhetoric coming out? What we're going to do, we're going to start online classes for children. We're going to have summer schools and extra this, that, and the other. And we're missing that important thing about well-being and learning. We're not hearing the messages that we've had. So I'm sorry, I'm skewing the question a little bit, because I'm desperate to get this in. No, we've only got a short amount of time. But if we don't learn from this, and what we do then is we hurt the well-being of our young people, who are already desperate for social interactions in different ways, and relationships that they haven't had after lockdown, and head teachers and teachers who are absolutely on their knees by giving them more to do, because we're worried about a catch-up curriculum, whatever that means, you know, because are we clear about who's lost what? Are we clear about, so we need to develop, so going back to the question, we need to develop relationships online. We need to take the lessons of well-being as seriously as we can, and think about our post-lockdown, how do we think about both of those. We must be careful that we hear the messages, but we totally ignore them.
Thanks, Karine. And actually,
question, because I've skewed it a bit, because I wanted to get that in.
Actually, that answer has covered off a lot of the other questions that are there already. We've had so many fantastic questions. Thank you very much for being such an engaged audience, everyone out there. That's fantastic. The report will be published on the Cambridge Partnership for Education website, and also the Educate Ventures website. And as Rose said earlier on, this is just the very start of this debate. So we really look forward to engaging with you more. But I think for now we're out of time. Rose, any closing remarks?
Yes, please sign up for our question for the week. We are continuing to do this, and it would be great to get some more people. It's one question. It takes like 30 seconds or less to answer, and we'd love to. So we will, in fact, actually, Roland's just put something in the chat about it. So please, yeah, he's put an email address where you can sign up and do that question. It's so quick, and yet it's so important for us, because it gives us that data that we can work with. So, and thank you for hosting the webinar. Thank you to the great panel, and thank you to all these brilliant question askers. Sorry.
Thanks, Rose, and echoing thanks to Charles, Karine and Carmel as well, and to you, of course. So thanks very much, and don't forget that the recording will be available to all attendees. But for now, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.